At 9:14 p.m. in Ottawa, the lights were still on inside the Privy Council office long after most of the building had emptied. Three senior trade advisors stood motionless near a conference table littered with briefing folders, half-drunk coffee, and glowing phone screens vibrating every few seconds with incoming messages from Washington, London, and Toronto. On one television mounted silently against the far wall, replay footage from earlier that evening continued looping across every major network in North America. Donald Trump was smiling. Mark Carney was not. The exchange had lasted less than 4 minutes during a televised bilateral economic forum in Washington. 4 minutes that would trigger one of the fastest geopolitical recalibrations in modern North American history. Trump had leaned forward beneath the studio lights, interrupted Carney twice, dismissed Canada's trade concerns as tiny problems from a country that survives because of America, and then delivered the line that instantly detonated across financial media. Without the United States, he said, pointing across the stage, Canada doesn't have leverage. Several people in the audience laughed. Carney did not respond immediately. He simply adjusted his papers, nodded once, and looked toward the moderator as if the comment had already been filed away for later analysis. The silence became uncomfortable. Then the cameras cut to commercial. Inside the Canadian delegation room afterward, almost nobody spoke during the first 90 seconds. One official later described the atmosphere as the moment before markets decide whether they still trust political leadership. Because beneath the spectacle, something far more dangerous had just happened. This was no longer about rhetoric. This was about sovereign credibility, and markets understood the implication immediately. By the time Asian trading desks opened 6 hours later, currency strategists at J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Nomura, and RBC were already circulating overnight notes warning clients about accelerating bilateral instability risk between the United States and Canada. Futures markets reacted before politicians did. The Canadian dollar initially dipped 1.3% against the US dollar in overnight trading before recovering sharply as rumors began spreading that Ottawa was preparing retaliatory measures far larger than anyone expected. At 5:42 a.m., one senior European diplomat sent a classified cable back to Brussels containing a single sentence. The Canadians appear calm, which is concerning, because experienced negotiators understand something emotional leaders often forget. Silence is not always weakness. Sometimes silence is calculation. And Mark Carney had spent most of his professional life studying systemic pressure for a living. Former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, Carney belonged to a different psychological universe than most elected politicians. He viewed crises the way bond markets view leverage, not emotionally, but structurally. Public humiliation mattered less than institutional positioning. Television moments disappeared in hours. Strategic leverage could last decades. That distinction would become critically important over the next 24 hours. Because while television audiences debated who had won the exchange, Canada's government quietly began executing one of the most coordinated economic repositioning efforts in its modern history. And Washington did not see it coming. At 7:10 a.m., Ottawa time, secure calls began connecting Canadian officials with provincial premiers, pension fund executives, trade negotiators, central bank advisors, and energy ministers. Phones vibrated continuously inside offices in Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver, Montreal, and Ottawa. Internal briefing documents circulated under urgent classifications. By mid-morning, officials at Global Affairs Canada were reportedly working from 3 separate crisis coordination rooms simultaneously, but the real damage had not yet begun. Because the problem was larger than the television exchange itself. The problem was what the exchange revealed. For years, economists had quietly warned that the United States and Canada were entering a dangerous phase of strategic asymmetry. Nearly 75% of Canadian exports still flowed into American markets. Supply chains across automotive manufacturing, energy infrastructure, agriculture, rare minerals, and defense production had become deeply intertwined over decades of continental integration. That interdependence created prosperity. It also created vulnerability. And vulnerabilities become geopolitical leverage during moments of political instability. Trump's public posture that night may have been designed for domestic audiences, aggressive, dominant, theatrical, a negotiation through pressure and spectacle, but institutional actors interpreted it differently. Sovereign wealth funds interpreted it differently. CEOs interpreted it differently. Central banks interpreted it differently. Because markets can survive conflict, they rarely survive unpredictability. Within hours, analysts across Europe and Asia began reassessing North American trade stability assumptions that had existed since NAFTA's original framework. Insurance pricing on cross-border supply contracts moved higher. Energy traders began modeling disruption scenarios. Bond desks discussed governance risk exposure. Not because war was imminent, because uncertainty had suddenly entered the system, and economic systems run on confidence. Confidence is fragile. At 11:26 a.m., Carney entered a closed meeting inside the Langevin block in Ottawa. Witnesses later described the room as unusually quiet. No raised voices, no theatrical outrage, no visible panic. One provincial official reportedly placed a thick binder on the table labeled Strategic Dependency Exposure. Inside were months of contingency planning. Because Canada had been preparing for this possibility far longer than Washington realized. Over the previous 18 months, Canadian ministries had quietly expanded discussions with European energy buyers, Indo-Pacific trade blocs, semiconductor manufacturers, and sovereign investment partners. Officials had studied alternative supply chain architectures, rare earth processing capacity, Arctic shipping routes, LNG export acceleration, digital infrastructure independence, financial settlement diversification. Most of these discussions attracted almost no media attention at the time. Now they suddenly mattered. At 1:04 p.m., the first coordinated signal emerged. The Canadian government announced a fast-tracked strategic review of all bilateral procurement dependencies tied to critical infrastructure and defense manufacturing. The language sounded bureaucratic, technical, almost dull. Markets understood the meaning immediately. Canada was signaling that access to its industrial ecosystem could no longer be treated as politically unconditional. That changed everything. Because Canada occupies a uniquely underestimated position inside the global economic order. It possesses enormous reserves of uranium, potash, freshwater, oil, natural gas, timber, lithium, nickel, cobalt, and rare earth minerals essential to advanced manufacturing and military technologies. It controls critical Arctic geography. It operates inside the G7 financial system while maintaining comparatively high sovereign credibility. For decades, many of those advantages remained partially invisible, precisely because the US-Canada alliance appeared permanent. Now allies were quietly asking an uncomfortable question. What if permanence itself had become unstable? At NATO headquarters in Brussels, diplomats reportedly spent part of the afternoon reassessing continental supply resilience scenarios. In Berlin, manufacturing analysts discussed exposure risks involving Canadian critical minerals. In Tokyo, trade officials accelerated consultations regarding Pacific export partnerships. Meanwhile, in Washington, many political operatives still treated the situation like a television victory cycle. That disconnect became increasingly dangerous. Because political theater operates on headlines, institutional systems operate on incentives, and incentives were beginning to shift. At 2:37 p.m., the Toronto Stock Exchange experienced a sharp surge in energy and infrastructure equities linked to export diversification expectations. Pipeline firms rose, port logistics companies rose, rail transport stocks rose. Analysts began openly discussing the possibility that Canada could accelerate non-US trade corridors faster than previously assumed. The irony was extraordinary. An attempt to publicly diminish Canadian leverage was now forcing global markets to reassess how much leverage Canada actually possessed. Leverage cuts both ways. Inside the White House Economic Advisory Circle, concern reportedly began growing by late afternoon, as intelligence briefings indicated unusually coordinated messaging between Canadian ministries and major institutional investors. One briefing reportedly warned that Canadian response patterns suggest long-horizon strategic repositioning rather than short-term retaliation. That distinction mattered enormously. Short-term retaliation creates noise. Long-term repositioning changes systems, and systems once altered are difficult to reverse. At approximately 4:20 p.m., a closed-door meeting took place between Canadian energy executives and federal officials in Calgary. Multiple participants later described the tone as coldly pragmatic. No speeches, no nationalism, just numbers, export capacities, refinery bottlenecks, Asian demand projections, European LNG pricing, shipping timelines, infrastructure financing. One executive reportedly summarized the moment with a sentence that would later circulate quietly through policy circles. If reliability becomes political, markets will purchase redundancy. That was the moment officials realized the crisis was becoming irreversible. Because the issue was no longer about Trump and Carney personally. The issue was institutional trust. And institutional trust takes decades to build and minutes to damage. The following morning, less than 24 hours after the televised exchange, Canada unveiled a coordinated package of strategic economic measures that stunned both allies and adversaries. The announcements arrived carefully, sequentially, methodically, expanded Indo-Pacific trade acceleration talks, new critical minerals investment frameworks, infrastructure fast-tracking tied to Atlantic export expansion, procurement diversification reviews, enhanced sovereign investment coordination, energy corridor reassessments, and perhaps most importantly, quiet signals to European and Asian partners that Canada was prepared to deepen long-term strategic integration outside exclusive dependence on the United States. No dramatic speeches accompanied the rollout, no emotional retaliation, no televised outrage, only policy, only systems, only leverage. Markets reacted immediately. The Canadian dollar surged 2.1% over the next trading session. Energy futures climbed. Foreign investment speculation intensified. Several major banks revised long-term Canadian strategic outlooks upward. One London-based macro strategist described the shift bluntly during a client call. Canada has stopped behaving like a junior partner. That sentence echoed through financial circles with remarkable speed. Because historically, global power transitions rarely begin with explosions. They begin with recalculations, quiet ones. Inside foreign ministries across Europe, another realization was taking shape. If the United States could publicly destabilize its closest economic relationships so casually, then every allied dependency framework suddenly required review. Diplomats from Germany, France, Japan, and South Korea reportedly began discussing broader strategic redundancy planning within days. The implications extended far beyond North America, because alliances are not held together by treaties alone. They are held together by predictability. And predictability had just been weakened on live television. The consequences spread further than most television analysts initially understood. Automotive manufacturers in Ontario began privately evaluating accelerated domestic battery supply chains independent of U.S. regulatory uncertainty. European defense contractors increased outreach toward Canadian industrial partnerships. Asian sovereign wealth funds quietly expanded discussions involving Canadian infrastructure exposure. Money was moving, not dramatically, strategically, and capital flows often reveal geopolitical expectations long before governments publicly acknowledge them. Meanwhile, Trump's inner circle reportedly remained divided about the severity of the situation. Some advisors viewed Canada's moves as temporary negotiation tactics. Others warned that the administration had triggered a larger strategic realignment without fully appreciating the long-term consequences, because power often mistakes size for durability. The United States remained vastly larger economically and militarily than Canada. Nobody disputed that reality. But modern geopolitical leverage is rarely determined by size alone. It is determined by reliability, strategic positioning, and institutional trust within interconnected systems. Small disruptions inside critical systems can produce enormous downstream consequences, especially when allies begin hedging simultaneously. By the third day, American manufacturing groups were already warning about rising uncertainty surrounding cross-border procurement planning. Agricultural exporters raised concerns about retaliatory frameworks. Logistics firms began preparing contingency models. CEOs requested clarity from Washington that did not yet exist. And uncertainty itself became economically expensive. Trade wars are expensive. Ego-driven trade wars become historic. One particularly revealing moment occurred during a closed investment conference in New York 48 hours after the original exchange. A senior institutional investor reportedly told attendees that the real story was not Canada's retaliation itself. The real story, he said quietly, is that markets now believe Canada is serious. That changed investor psychology completely. Because once markets conclude that political behavior reflects structural change rather than temporary emotion, repricing accelerates rapidly, sovereign relationships begin adjusting, capital reallocates, risk models change, insurance costs move, infrastructure priorities shift, alliances quietly evolve, and the original political moment becomes almost irrelevant compared to the systems it destabilized. In Ottawa, officials appeared fully aware of this dynamic. Carney himself remained publicly restrained throughout the escalating fallout. No personal attacks, no emotional speeches, no rhetorical escalation. Only measured language, only institutional framing, only calm references to sovereignty, economic resilience, diversification, and strategic independence. To some observers, the restraint looked almost unnerving, because calm leaders become especially dangerous when systems begin moving in their favor. Late one evening, nearly a week after the original confrontation, several senior diplomats gathered privately at a residence in Washington. According to one attendee, the conversation eventually drifted away from tariffs, speeches, and personalities entirely. Instead, they discussed something much larger: whether the post Cold War assumption of permanent Western alignment was beginning to fracture under the pressure of domestic political volatility. That is the kind of conversation officials usually avoid having out loud. But history has a way of forcing hidden anxieties into the open, and this crisis had exposed something many institutions were already quietly fearing. Strategic dependency had become a liability. The television exchange between Trump and Carney now looked less like an isolated political clash and more like a stress test for the architecture of modern alliances themselves. Could advanced democracies still maintain stable long-term economic integration when political volatility increasingly dominated short-term decision-making? Could supply chains built over 40 years survive escalating governance unpredictability? Could institutional trust survive public humiliation politics? Markets were beginning to answer those questions in real time, and their answers were not comforting. In the months that followed, Canada accelerated multiple diversification initiatives that had previously moved slowly through bureaucratic channels. Energy infrastructure approvals gained urgency. Trade diplomacy intensified across the Indo-Pacific. European partnerships deepened. Domestic industrial policy shifted toward resilience planning rather than pure efficiency optimization. The strategic philosophy itself was changing. Efficiency maximizes profits during stability. Resilience preserves sovereignty during instability. That realization transformed policymaking across much of the Western world after the crisis, because what happened between Trump and Carney was never just about two men. It was about two different theories of power. One believed pressure creates submission. The other understood pressure often creates adaptation, and adaptation can permanently alter systems. Historians may eventually look back on that televised exchange not as the cause of the transformation, but as the moment the transformation became visible to everyone else. The moment hidden tensions surfaced. The moment allies began recalculating. The moment markets started repricing political behavior itself. The moment institutional trust stopped being assumed. In the end, the humiliation itself barely mattered. Public moments fade quickly. What mattered were the incentives unleashed afterward. What mattered was the realization spreading quietly through capitals, boardrooms, central banks, and sovereign investment funds across the world. If alliances could become emotionally unstable, then strategic independence suddenly became economically rational. That realization is still reshaping global policy today. And perhaps the most remarkable part of the entire episode was how little it resembled traditional political drama by the end. No explosions, no declarations, no victory speeches, just systems moving, quietly, irreversibly. Because history is often misunderstood as a sequence of dramatic events. In reality, history usually changes when institutions begin behaving differently after a single revealing moment. One televised exchange, 4 minutes, and 24 hours later, Canada changed everything. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.